Okay, so first off, you should still be reading the written tutorials linked to on the website, because this will not give you everything you need to know. This will just reinforce important points, so please read those. Okay, so first off, we're going to look at a very basic program that I put together here, and we're going to look at what each part does. So this first part, this is an include directive to the preprocessor, which is the first part of the compiler that runs. And here we're telling it to go find a file called iostream, and this particular file gives us all sorts of goodies for input and output via standard input and output, which is through the terminal, not through fancy GUIs. And so the important thing about include is that allows us to include, hence the term, already pre-written code so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Excuse me. So next, this is not entirely necessary, but it makes your life a lot easier. What it does is that when the compiler can't find a symbol, which is anything like mynum or int, or especially in this case cout, it tells it to look in this namespace called std. And a namespace, simply put, is kind of like a folder in your build environment. It contains different variables and functions that, and they're all under a name like that. So that's what they're used for. Int main is as the name suggests, is a main part of the function, and that is what the computer will execute when it starts up the program. And so it's you'll get more into functions later, but this is all main right here, everything between these curly brackets. And the computer will execute all the code until it reaches this return statement. And you'll learn more about return statements again when you get to functions, but for right now all you need to know is that it makes the program end. So if you put anything after this, nothing will run. There can be meaning to these return numbers. For example, you can make it a 1, and that would tell that usually most OSs read that as an error occurred, and that's usually what that's for, but for right now all I need to return is 0. Okay, so firstly we have a variable declaration, which is an integer, and we'll get into more in different types of variables. But so you always, when you have variables, you always need to declare them, otherwise the compiler doesn't know what kind of variable it is. And once you've declared it, you don't need to use the type keyword anymore, in this case int. So you wouldn't do this. Because that would confuse the compiler. You just say mynum, and that's it. So, and we'll talk about this statement more when we get with operators. Alright, so here we have an output stream. You can tell because it has this fancy this little operator right here. And between these operators we have different output operations. So these are individual operations. They usually contain a reference to one value. So you can have expressions in here, like say you have mynum, and you want it to increase the value of mynum and show that, but not actually increase what's stored in there. So you could say +1, and that would work. But you can't have, like, say another variable and called x. That wouldn't work. So you could do that. Endl is one of the ways of ending a line in an output stream. The more C way to do it is to use \n, not mn, and so that's the more C way to do it. And really, it doesn't matter that much, but I prefer endl. And so you see another string we're outputting here. So it's going to go in order. So you're going to see my very first program, and then an end of line, and on the next line, please insert an integer, and then an end of line. And then we get to this part right here, which is input. And it has the other operator here, and this is very similar to a stream. You just take from the user, you get this mynum right here, and whatever the user gives you is stored in mynum. Now the tutorial at c++.com mentions a function called cin.getLine, and this has its uses, but it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. For example, really what the difference is that the getLine function will not parse spaces, but this will. So if you want spaces in your input, then you would use getLine. If not, you would use this. And for the most part, you really only would need this. I would only use getLine if you need the spaces, but for the most part, you really only need this. And to be honest with you, this is much simpler than the getLine. So, alright, so now we'll look at operators when it goes to the next file. Okay, so let's put some basic include statements here, some stuff that you saw. Okay. Okay, so your first data type, an int, which is just an integer, so any positive or negative value that isn't a decimal. So, then next up you have two different types. You have a float and a double, and these have very similar functions. They both can give you decimals, and these can be positive or negative, but the difference is in how much space they take in your RAM. And you'll see exactly what that difference is when I show you the full name. So this full name is called a floating point number. This is known as a double floating point number. And as you probably gathered, the double takes twice as much space as the float does. Now, it used to be that you wouldn't use doubles because that would eat up your memory, but now since we have so much memory, it really doesn't matter. So, really, the other thing is that doubles can store more larger numbers because they're bigger. But aside from that, it really doesn't matter which one you use as long as you're consistent. That's my only request. Next up, you have a char. You can type. And this stores a single character. So, for example, so you store the letter F into my char. Note my use of single quotes here. I don't think it's entirely necessary, but some compilers, depending on the situation you're using it, will yell at you if you use double quotes. So my rule, single letter, single quotes, multiple letters, double quotes. Easy to remember. And you have a string, which allows you to store a string of chars. So in this case you would use double quotes. So like that, not like that, like that. So that would be that. And then finally you have another data type called a bool, which is named after a mathematician whose last name is Boolean. I cannot remember his first name. He was the guy who basically invented Boolean logic, and you can see where the name comes from, and that's basically true and false logic. And it's a cornerstone of computer programming. So really it just stores a true or false value. So you just tell it true or false.